For reasons I don't quite understand, going into this demo of Star Wars ShatterPoint, I really wanted to not like this game, but yeah, I ended up pre-ordering a copy. So Star Wars ShatterPoint is the upcoming tabletop miniatures game from Atomic Mass Games. Obviously it's set in the Star Wars universe. It's going to be released in about a week from when this video is being recorded, and after my demo I thought I'd give you some of my first thoughts of the game. So this is a squad level game. Currently each side is going to have 8 character bases on the table. I'm using the term character bases because some of those miniature bases actually have multiple miniatures on them, like the battle droids, but they function as a single miniature for the most part. There's a little bit of screwiness going on there. There's also a fairly rigid force organization structure, we can call it, to this. We got to have a primary character, secondary character, and some squads. Maybe that might change in the future. I'm not entirely sure, but that seems to be the direction they're going, at least in the early stages of this game. And of course, there is going to be meta between some of the characters, so they interact with their special powers in certain ways, as well as some characters kind of buff up other characters to let them do cool things, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Now, I'm kind of indifferent in how this force structure thing is working right now. I got to see how it plays out. The one thing I'm not a big fan of, and this is not unique to Star Wars ShatterPoint, this is me complaining about games forever, it's that I'm not a big fan of where you can have multiple factions work together, which you can to some degree in Star Wars ShatterPoint. Details on Atomic Mass Games website. I know it's a trope in science fiction where you have good guys and bad guys fighting together. It happens enough that it's kind of cool, but I don't like it how it can happen all the time in these tabletop miniatures games. Just my opinion. One thing I really like about the structure of the objectives is that it's based very heavily around objective control and not killing your opponent. In fact, it feels kind of difficult to wipe out your opponent. I don't know how practical it is. I could see the meta getting out of hand in the future to where you can just table people pretty easily, which wouldn't be good. But I do like the fact that right now it's more about area control and how do you do that versus trying to kill your opponents as fast as possible. Frankly, too many tabletop miniature games are about that. I like what Atomic Mass Games is doing here. One unique way of how they're approaching this is that one of the problems that pretty much every tabletop game out there has is where you just concentrate firepower on a unit and eliminate it. Now in Star Wars ShatterPoint, what happens is when you do so much damage to a unit, it becomes wounded, and while it's in this wounded state, it actually can't take any additional damage. So it's kind of an artificial mechanic, but it keeps you from just doing this constant fire at somebody until they're destroyed. And then there's some rules about how the woundings take place and eventually the character gets destroyed. But there's some more details there that's not normally found in tabletop miniature games. And then finally, on this topic, the game is divided into up to 3 struggles. Each struggle is a set of objectives you have to control. And essentially you got to outscore your opponent. But there's some interesting ways as to how you can reduce the amount of, I guess, the points you got to outscore your opponent by, because you can read about the struggle tracker on AMG's website. And the first player to win 2 out of 3 of these struggles will win the game. Now these are some of the more different-ish, I say that because a lot of games have similar mechanics, but you know, it's how you mix things together. Force points are your special power points, and your 2 force users, I guess I'm going to use the term Force users because not always Jedi, but then again, General Grievous is coming out and he's not a Force user, so I don't know how that's going to work with him. But the point is, your primary characters generate these special points at the beginning of a set of character activations, and these are the things you use to do cool stuff. So a number of your special abilities on all your characters will require you to spend Force points. Obviously some cost more than others, all that kind of stuff, and that's how you can unleash some of the more powerful aspects of your squad. And there's some other things throughout the game you can use these force points for. Now when it comes to the topic of special abilities, it's pretty much kind of like your usual stuff you're used to Fantasy Flight, AMG, and the cards do look a little bit like Marvel Crisis Protocol. And you've got your usual set of crazy icons, because you know, FFG and AMG, they love crazy icons. Every game has that kind of stuff. So some of the abilities are kind of like things you can use during your turn. Some of them count as actions. We'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later. Some are reactions to what other things going on in the game, and some are called innate abilities, which are things that just kind of happen. The difference between those things that just kind of happen and reactions is reactions may cost some of those force points I talked about, where the innate abilities do not cost any force points. So all in all, force points and mechanics like this, I like these kind of things because it forces the player to make interesting choices. They have limited resources to do cool things. And hopefully, if the game is well designed, it's going to be hard choices as to what they actually have to do. Special abilities, you know, it once again is a game design thing. Fantasy Flight, AMG love this type of meta building. And the challenge you have with a game like this is it can become too much about meta building and not a whole lot about what you do on the battlefield. Now, the fact that this game is so much about objective control and moving to capture objectives, that may balance out any of the crazy meta building, where oftentimes a lot of the meta building is about just killing your opponent as fast as possible. So hopefully, either there's not a lot of this meta building in the game, because I'm personally not a big fan of that, or the fact that the objective control and choices you make in the battlefield will balance it out enough to where there's a lot more fun, tactical thought about the actual actions you take during the course of the game. Unit activation. Now this is one of the other things that's kind of different about ShatterPoint. You don't necessarily get to choose what character you activate when. You have a deck of cards that corresponds to every unit in your squad, I guess we'll call it squad. Sure, that works. And then you also have a wild card. Now there are some ways you can manipulate this deck. For the most part though, whatever you flip over is the character you have to activate. The one universal way you have to manipulate the deck is that when you flip over a card, if you don't want to activate that, you can put it in reserve for one force point to use it later. However, you can only have one card in reserve, and there's some other details about that. Now, I like this for two reasons. One, once again, hopefully it forces the player to make interesting and difficult choices on the battlefield. And the other thing that's hopefully good about it is that it kind of spoils some of that meta building. Oh, and there's one other neat little thing about this deck that I like. Some of the characters have start of activation special abilities, and those characters have a unique symbol on their card reminding you that they have the start of activation ability. That is awesome. I remember the one time I was playing in a Warhammer Fantasy Battles tournament, and I kept forgetting to use the Engine of Gods ability on my Stegodon. So I had it written down in giant bold letters, start of turn, use Engine of Gods. So what they did with this little just extra bonus icon on the card is awesome. Nice design touch, AMG. When it comes to movement and actions, this is pretty run-of-the-mill stuff for AMG Fantasy Flight. Each character gets to make 2 actions, and there are things like movement, combat, dash, recover. Just your typical kind of stuff you'd expect to find in a game like this. Movement uses movement tools similar to what you would have, for example, in Star Wars Legion or Marvel Crisis Protocol. This guy here is obviously from Star Wars Legion, but they're not exactly the same. It's a little annoying, but the movement tool inside ShatterPoint is a little bit of a different length than the ones from Star Wars Legion, so hopefully you weren't planning to be able to get away with these for, you know, splitting up a starter set or something like that. It is what it is. Now, combat has some interesting aspects to it that I kind of like. First of all, every unit has what's called a stance card. You see it here below the main unit stat card. And this thing contains all the information you need for fighting combat for that character or unit. Essentially, it gives the attack, defense, and weapon abilities here. And your primary characters actually have a double-sided card that they can change between during the game. And it may give them more of a certain aggressive or defensive stance. Like I know, for example, with Darth Maul, he has one side that allows him to throw his lightsaber and gives him a little bit better defense. And on the other side, he becomes a close combat monster per se. So when you want to charge him into combat or slash people up, you want to swap to that stance. When it comes to the actual combat itself, there's a pretty standard dice mechanic. You have attack dice, defense dice, and yes, they're custom. Because why would you not have a game where you can charge $15 for a set of dice? Says the guy who's kind of complaining about that, even though he just paid $10 for a set of 2d6s that the Calhoun's logo on it. You just got to be able to get me to buy the right kind of dice, and I'll pay whatever money you want for them. But anyway, and it's kind of Fantasy Flight AMG stuff. You have critical hits. The one thing that's kind of interesting about these dice, though, is you have something called expertise on them. And then based on how many of these expertise results you roll, each character has a different little mini chart. There's a chart for attack, a chart for defense, and that does some interesting ways in how it affects the overall combat. And the other thing that's kind of different about ShatterPoint, they borrowed the kind of damage tables from that Gladiator fighting game, Arena Rex. So if those tables you see there on that stance card look familiar, it's because they're basically what you get in Arena Rex, where after you resolve your attack and defense, you figure out how many hits you did to your opponent, and then you move along that track a certain number of spaces equal to the hits, and it applies damage and other interesting, unique results to the combat. You can push people back, you can stun them per se, or you knock their weapons out. There's things like that you can apply to them, just like in Arena Rex, because it's basically the same mechanic. But it's really kind of cool. It's something a little bit different that you don't see too often in other games. First of all, with the starter set, it is a really good value. It's a pretty cool starter set. And it seemed like I had a pretty good experience with what was in there. It was a fun game to play. The one little thing that's a little annoying about it, though, is that it's a one tabletop starter set and not a two-player starter set. So what I mean by that is I was kind of hoping to split this starter set with a friend where I keep one side, he keeps the other. But it's basically impossible to split this set up in a way where each player walks away with a totally playable thing. There's not enough of certain items like the mission cards, the struggle tracker, and you have a minimum set of terrain in there. So, plus you also have only one set of dice and one set of movement tools. So you're looking at, it's like you're in this funny spot where if you wanted to split up the units in the starter set, but each player wanted a set of terrain and they need a set of dice and a set of movement templates, it's only like $10 more, maybe $15 more for that other player to buy their own copy of the starter set. Then you're kind of stuck with units you don't really want necessarily. It's just one of those little things. It is what it is. And that's basically all I've got to say in Star Wars ShatterPoint. It was a lot more fun than I expected, and I'm looking forward to picking up my copy here in about a week. The miniatures are really cool. They're very well-made miniatures. They look awesome. So yeah, I'll probably be doing some paint tutorials on them. The terrain's really nice as well. And I'm sure I'm already planning a few tutorials on Blender for making your own Star Wars ShatterPoint terrain. The only one nitpicky thing with the miniatures is the lightsabers are probably going to break because they're just long, thin plastic. And you can't toss these miniatures in a box and expect this kind of stuff not to break. They're just a little too spindly for that. But other than that issue, I think the game's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to playing it here. And hopefully picking up General Grievous in about a month. I believe he comes out sometime in July. And then that'll probably be somehow work into my starter force. Yeah, I haven't figured out. I'm taking the bad guys this time around, probably. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. I've rambled on for way too long at this point. So thank you guys all for watching. And I'll see you next time where I'm thinking I'm going to be painting up the new Ahsoka miniature for Star Wars Legion. Or possibly finally getting to my 3D printed sci-fi military vehicles. One of the two. I'm not sure how things are going to go. We'll see what happens.